Hey, good morning, everybody. My name is Jeff Fritz. Welcome back to my live stream. Today is July 17th, 2018. I'm wearing a new hat today. I'm wearing my Lucio hat that I got. I've been watching the Overwatch esports playoffs and been thrilled with some of the first person shooter action that we've been seeing out there. It's been amazing. My team, the Philadelphia Fusion, advanced, so I'm all excited for this week because we play New York. But I'm also excited today because I've got a guest. I'm thrilled to share and bring on. We've had a little bit of problem with the camera, but I'm going to bring on Rocky Lhotka. There's his profile pic. Hey, Rocky.
Hey, good morning.
Good morning. So, gosh, we've known each other for a little bit here, and you've been working on this CSLA project for a long time, since, gosh, early 2000s, right?
Well, even before that, because there was a version of it in COM. So the framework itself is over 20 years old now.
Wow. Okay, so besides CSLA, why don't you give people the quick rundown of who you are, what you do?
Sure. I'm the CTO at a company called Magenic, and we're a software development consulting company that crosses the whole US. We've got around 600, 700 consultants somewhere in there. And
Awesome.
over the last, very long period of time, I've been writing books and doing a lot of public speaking around building enterprise software using the Microsoft platforms, originally COM and then .NET, which was so much nicer. and but my passion is and has been for most of my career around distributed computing and also object-oriented design and object-oriented programming. And the two don't always go together seamlessly, and so it's an interesting space for me to live in, talking about ways to kind of marry the two and get the best of both worlds.
Oh, there's definitely something to be said about how do we more effectively do distributed computing? How do we grow our architectures in our applications once we get past those that first dozen or so users, right? And you need to maintain and grow an application. It's a challenge that we've all got to learn differently. It feels like there's no one solution for everything, right?
No, there's definitely not. And we've seen that over the years, right? There was component-oriented approaches and some, well, first I suppose there was RPC, remote procedure calls, but
Mm.
then you get Corba and DCOM and some of those technologies from the 90s.
Okay.
I
Yeah.
think a lot of lessons were learned there, good and bad.
And it's funny how we laugh at the bad lessons because we've been through it. We've seen the pain at times, and I think we have moved into a better place, right? We've learned how to maintain and avoid some of that pain. Uh,
Well, that's true. And, I mean, we went through a very successful, vibrant period with N-tier um, technologies,
Early two
starting,
thousands, yeah.
starting as early, well, theoretically for as early as 96 with MTS and Java Beans
Mm.
but yeah, it was really by, probably 98, 99. I think everything had matured to the point that people were highly productive sitting down and creating an end tier app, and um, and there was a lot to be said for that. But then along comes the whole service oriented concept and um, SOA, which kind of most people in my view, like most being 98% probably,
Okay.
um, ended up using the technologies for service-oriented programming or architecture to recreate N-tier architectures.
So N-tier architecture, to make sure that folks who haven't been familiar with it, right? That's like a three-tier architecture where, right, you had a client, a server, some business object layer somewhere in there, and you might grow and add other layers as well.
Yep, yep, and a database typically.
Yeah.
Yep. So that was
So
your third, right?
yeah. So now CSLA, right? We've got some folks in the chat room. It sounds like they know a little bit about CSLA. For those that haven't, for those that are watching on YouTube, watching the recording after, can you give the quick rundown of what that is?
So yeah,
Or would it make sense to go to the screen and
it might make sense to go to the screen share if you can. Yeah,
not a problem. I will go to Rocky's screen. There we go. Right there.
and yes, this is the homepage for CSLAnet.com. And from here you get links to all the goodies. Um, the diagram that I've got, if I zoom into that on the page, really kind of sums up. I mean, CSLA's purpose in life is to make business logic a first-class citizen in our applications.
Can you do me a favor and just scroll it a little bit to the right? I think I may have the left side of the screen. There we go. That's good.
There we go.
Yep.
So yeah, we've got all these fantastic frameworks for creating various kinds of user experience, right? Ranging from Windows Forms all the way up through ASP.NET Core and Razor and Xamarin. And we've got all these great technologies for talking to databases, Entity Framework and Dapper and ADO.NET. But what there has never been is a consistent, repeatable home for business logic.
Okay.
And that's really what CSLA's primary goal is. It's all about trying to set up a way for you to create a set of domain-driven business objects using object-oriented design or domain-driven design, and encapsulate your business rules in a way that is reusable in 1-tier, 2-tier, 3-tier, 4-tier architectures, but then also across everywhere that C# runs or .NET runs, you ought to be able to take that same business logic and run it.
Now that's an interesting statement right there. Everywhere that .NET runs. And gosh, back in 2000, 2001, when you moved to .NET, that was simple. Everywhere that there was Windows, you had .NET. But now I guess you've got a little bit of a challenge with CSLA and all of the .NETs that we have now, right?
It got extremely messy there for a while. There was prior to Net Standard 2 coming out, I was building CSLA for 11 different flavors of .NET.
Okay, 11.
Yep.
Wow. Where's my
Net
sound
Standard.
effects? What? Right, 11 .NETs. Are you kidding?
Yep. No, if you look at the NuGet packages from even 18 months ago, there were 11 different variations or 11 different CSLA.dlls, each one compiled for a different flavor of .NET.
Okay. That's impressive, having that many different DLLs that you were recompiling each time. Oh my gosh. Okay.
Yeah, it had gotten, there's a reason Microsoft invested so much in creating that standard, and it was to clean up that mess.
Oh my gosh, yes. Folks like you, folks like James Newton King with JSON.NET, trying to accomplish that same thing of I have a general purpose library or framework that I want to work everywhere there's a .NET.
Yep.
Wow.
Yep.
Okay. So we've got a general framework for managing business logic across the .NETs. So I'm guessing these are things like my accounting rules. I have a framework that I can put all of those into a business object to maintain and manage those things.
Right, that's the idea. So CSLA's got a rules engine.
Okay.
That helps you create your rules in a repeatable, testable manner, and then attach those rules to domain objects or properties, usually on domain objects, so that you're able to evaluate individual properties, but then also evaluate across properties and even across what's called an object graph. So if you've got like sales order that has line items, and the line items may even have detail items. All of those combined form what's called an object graph.
Okay.
And so in kind of an enterprise application scenario, you very easily would have business rules that when somebody changes some detail line on a line item in the sales order, that might affect other line items or the sales order itself. And so you've got to be able to have business rules that can affect the entire object graph.
So some of those things that might change, thinking out loud, right? If I were to do something like a partial shipment, or if I completed the billing for an order, those might be ways that I might change the status of that order object that affects the object graph.
Yeah, exactly right. You
Okay.
might mark a line item as, we're not going to ship it today, we're going to ship it in the future. And that might affect a discount that you would have gotten had you shipped it all in one day, or
Maybe it creates a discount. Oh, sorry, this is back ordered. Save
yep,
$10 next time.
yeah, all sorts of possibilities. That's
Okay.
right.
So you have a rules engine that helps to drive some of that logic and for maintaining the state of the business objects.
Yep, that's exactly right.
Okay. Um, yeah, we've got some folks in the chat room that are saying, okay, I need to know how this works. My only problem is that I don't yet know how it works. Okay. Yeah. So you have a couple samples that you can share with us. And to be clear, CSLA, this is on NuGet. Is this free? Is there a licensing cost with this?
No, it's open source, so it's MIT. If we go to the GitHub repository, in fact, it's just on GitHub, freely available with an MIT license. Simple and straightforward.
I'll Vanna it up here. There you go. Look at that. All right. The fun with chroma key and being overlaid over your content. Look, it's right here.
It's so cool.
Oh my gosh, it's the games that I can play with being here in the corner of Visual Studio. Okay, so anybody can grab this and can get involved with using it. Of course, I'm guessing there's paid support, there's paid training available as well.
No, not really. What I do in order, and this is philosophical, right? But if you look at an open source project, in my view, and it doesn't have some funding stream, then you've got to wonder how long it'll be around.
Yes.
And so, yes, I think it's important to understand CSLA's funding stream is that I write books and create training videos.
Okay.
And sell them directly out of my own store. And then I've also got a patron, so I work for Magenic.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And I've been with Magenic for 18 years now. And all that time, they've been extremely supportive of CSLA and my work with CSLA and so forth. And so it's really a combination of patronship from Magenic and then revenue generated from books and videos and public speaking. I speak at VS Live and a variety of other conferences and events.
Before we finish here today, let's make sure we get those links and drop them in the chat room, and I'll make sure they get attached to the YouTube video as well, so that folks can follow up and get some more of your content.
That
Cool.
Sounds awesome.
Absolutely. All right, so we know what it is now. How do we use it? Right? If I'm interested, I want to get started. I want to start if I'm building an application, where's my jump in point?
Well, probably I've got a bunch of pre-built samples that we can walk through, but just to give that super basic, and nowadays the trend is all console apps because apparently GUIs are passe, right? So
they're going out of style, and everybody loves ASCII art.
Yeah, I know. Don't ask me, man. I don't understand. But so I'll just create a new console app because that's all the rage.
Oh yeah.
We'll move on from here into some real apps, but
real apps.
But this will at least give like how do you jump in, right? And realistically, although I'm not going to do that for this sample app, but normally what you're going to do in a real app is you're going to create a class library for your data access layer, a class library for your business layer, and then one or more executable UIs, right?
Yes.
Your console app, your Windows Forms, and I'll get into that in the next demo. But for this particular case, I'm just going to keep it super easy, and we'll just violate all the best practices.
That's how you know you've arrived, is when you know when to violate the best practices.
And so I'm going to just grab the CSLA core NuGet package. There's a whole ton of different CSLA packages, and I'll get to that in a minute.
Okay.
But we'll just grab and install the CSLA core net standard package.
And I noticed this supports Net Standard 2, so it'll just work everywhere that you have a modern .NET.
Yeah, with a slight wrinkle with legacy full .NET because there's a bug in .NET. But
Yeah.
we'll get to that too, maybe. But
as somebody who worked on .NET 4.7.1 and 4.7.2, yeah.
All right. So again, breaking all the rules. We'll just put my class right here in
But for demo purposes, that's easy to find. It's easy to see. Okay, so you're creating a person object.
Yep. And then we'll add a using CSLA, so we get our IntelliSense and everything. And so here's, really it's a fairly straightforward class. The big thing is that I'm inheriting from CSLA.businessBase, which brings the rules engine and all the other kind of goodies that you would hope for.
Okay.
And then probably have an ID property that would be read-only, because that's kind of typical. And I'm using snippets because snippets are awesome.
Yeah, folks in Visual Studio Code are just starting to learn about this in those other non.NET languages that haven't used Visual Studio, and they're like, "Oh my gosh, this is great!"
Mm-hmm. Yep, and it really is. Part of the value of CSLA is that property declarations are highly standardized.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And they're a little more complex than, because you might say, well, geez, Rock, there is a standardized property.
Yeah, simple get set.
But the problem with that is that you really want to implement I property or I notify property changed, and there's actually a whole host of interfaces if you want to really play in the data binding world. And one of even though the intent of CSLA is to create business objects, or home for your business logic,
yeah.
Realistically, you also want it to be easy to use from Windows Forms and WPF and Xamarin and ASP.NET MVC, and so for it to be easy to use in all of those different scenarios, then you have to support data binding in all of those different UI technologies.
Okay, yeah. Can you do me a favor? Can you bump up your font size a couple points for our viewers? There we go. And yeah, I don't think we're worried about Solution Explorer and menus, but the text is good. Cool, thank you.
Yep, no problem. So
your the register property method here and your get and set property, these are actually allowing you to wire up and use some of those things like the iNotify property changed capabilities that are important for data binding and some of the more responsive UI frameworks that we want to integrate with.
That's exactly right. Yep. And not just that one, right? But there's iEdit, oh shoot, I don't even remember, iEditable object and iBinding list and iNotify data error info or an iData error info. And
so you've wrapped up all of those capabilities behind these methods that allow us to encapsulate our properties a little bit nicer. Nicer? Yeah.
Yep. Yep.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Yep. And you know, and because I've been doing this since the dawn of .NET, um, it turns out that all of those data binding interfaces are not implemented the same way by the different UI frameworks.
You're kidding. Okay.
Not at all. So if you optimize your the way you implement those interfaces for Windows Forms, then they might or might not work on WPF, but they won't work well. And the reverse is also true.
It's interesting that you say they won't work well. As somebody who doesn't have experience with WPF, I've got to dig into that just slightly. What do you mean it doesn't work well?
So, oh, for example, I mean, if we pick the easiest one, which is the property change notification,
Okay.
Windows Forms probably didn't do it right. So in Windows Forms, every time that you notify the UI that a property changed, it refreshes all the properties
Not
on the
just
whole
that
UI,
one.
not just that one. And in WPF, they did it more correctly, which is that they only refresh the properties that you tell it have changed. But
Okay.
what that means is that in Windows Forms, you want to raise property changed exactly one time. Even if you change like 5 properties, you don't want to raise property changed 5 times because it'll refresh the UI 5 times,
Oh man.
right? And so you want to batch it up, recognize that 5 things changed, and then call property changed once to refresh all 5 at once, right?
Sure.
But if you do that on WPF, then the UI won't refresh properly because it won't recognize that you changed 5 different properties.
Okay. Okay. So we want to trigger them differently for the different UI frameworks. Okay, that makes sense.
Yep.
Wow, I would have never found that on my own.
Yep. So CSLA does that for you.
Very cool.
It
Okay.
understands what environment you're running in and does the right thing, basically. So
Makes sense. Okay.
yeah, I
So
mean it's craziness, right? That's just like one of many examples where there's idiosyncratic differences between the platforms.
and it kind of speaks towards a little bit of the problem that we as a technical community have when we reinvent technologies, right? We need to learn from those other technologies before us, and it sounds like WPF learned from WinForms, but they never went back and fixed WinForms.
Correct. Yep.
Yeah. So, thank you for the follow there, Jesse.
So yeah, so basically, you know, this this idea of registering the property allows a lot of metadata about properties you can get from reflection, but this allows the framework to avoid the use of reflection, which was really important when Silverlight was a thing.
Okay.
Because Silverlight's support for reflection was limited on purpose because of the sandbox.
Right. You don't want people to be able to create things or inspect things that are outside of what they've been explicitly been given access to.
Yep. And and a lot of those issues have been relaxed. I think there was a lot of I'm going to call it irrational fear at that time that we've since backed off on, and reflection is, especially with Net Standard 2 now, reflection is consistent everywhere.
Yeah, it is.
Which is yay.
Oh yes.
It's still, it's nice to avoid reflection. This is a little bit faster, and also this is extensible because this register property method actually returns an I property info. So if you want to, you can add extra metadata about properties, which some people have done to, and I'm not sure this is a great idea, but they've done things like, oh, I'm going to make sure that part of my metadata understands what table and column this property came from, or different things like that.
Very cool to have that extensibility, right? This is that concept of add a layer of abstraction to simplify and solve problems. I mean, this is it in action, right?
Yeah, yeah, and to be fair, a lot of so much of this, again, the CSLA has been around the .NET version literally since the day .NET launched. So, whatever, 17 years ago or something, right?
Right. So you were in on the previews working on
Yep.
trying to make sure that you were compatible.
Yep. And but also because it's been around and it's had this really, really large, vibrant community. A lot of the cooler features, like what we're talking about right now, um, some of it came from my head, but an awful lot of it came out of the community and people using it and saying, "Hey, why is this so hard?" or "Couldn't you do that?" And sometimes I would implement those ideas, and sometimes people would submit would actually make the change and contribute. Over time, there's been somewhere around 65, 70 people that have contributed to CSLA, sometimes in small ways, but sometimes like the rules engine. I wrote the very base of it, but a gentleman from Norway named Johnny Beckham
Okay.
really took that and ran with it. So the fact that the rules engine is as sophisticated as it is largely his contribution. Yeah, I mean, it's pretty awesome.
And 70 folks contributing to the project, that's pretty healthy. That's terrific to hear that you've got that group that's able to support and help grow an open source project, right? An open source project with just 2 or 3 people is okay. It's moving, but I don't think of an open source project as really healthy until you cross that first 20 people and 70 people over the span of 15, 20 years. That's tremendous to hear.
Yeah, I love it. I mean, and I've built so many great friendships with people all over the world, and it's been a wonderful thing for me too. So,
There's definitely something to that teamwork of being of having a large group contributing together on a project. I want to real quick acknowledge Kiko Tuga just clicked follow as well as Jesse Skinner, but Kiko was our 2800th follower. Thanks so much. And Standby Reloading is hinting there. 2,200 more followers to go. Rocky, I made a promise. I don't. I may regret this, but I made a promise. I made a bet with our followers that if we got to 5,000 followers on the stream here before the middle of October, for the Halloween stream, I would dye my goatee rainbow. And it was something that somebody brought up. This would be really funny if you did this. I said, yeah, and if we made it to 5,000 followers, if we doubled our follower count in that time, I would dye my beard. And some folks are trying to recruit and get some of their friends to join in and follow us here, watch and enjoy the stream with us. But I may regret that. So enough about that distraction. So you're building out your person object here. You've inherited from business base, and you're starting to develop properties. You have a name, you have an ID. Makes sense. Okay. And the property info, that's a static read only. Is there a reason why it's static read only instead of a class instance version of the name property object there?
there is this property info gets loaded and cached the first time the first time the first instance of a person class is created.
Okay.
This all gets loaded and cached in memory and is therefore accessible through the rest of either the app domain or the runtime instance of the app, depending on your runtime.
Okay.
Um, and um, it's a performance optimization, right? It's
Uh,
kind of like reflection. You want to load the meta state or the metadata one time and then just keep it so that you can use it um, during the life of the app, but you don't want to have to be reloading it all the time.
so CSLA has a built-in in-memory cache that'll go and reload and find the objects for me.
The object metadata, anyway. Yeah, that's right.
Awesome. Okay.
This is one example of quite a few different optimizations like that where um, in fact, so let's add a rule just for fun here.
Okay.
So there's required, which is out of system component model data annotations.
That's a standard one. I've used that on Entity Framework. Okay.
Yep, and that dates back to .NET 3.5, I think. So it's been around a
Yeah.
long time.
Yeah.
The interesting thing about required in all of the rules, there's like 5 rules in that namespace.
Mm-hmm.
They were created originally to mediate between the entity framework and one of the early service-oriented implementations in WCF.
Okay. Yeah.
And then ASP.NET MVC picked up on them and said, "Oh, this is awesome. We could use that in order to generate JavaScript automatically in the browser to
Put
do
some
client
markup.
side." Yep,
Yeah.
right. And then Silverlight picked up on them and said, "Oh, we could use them to auto-generate rules or UI aspects based on these rules as well." But architecturally, I have a bone to pick here because business rules should run in the business layer, not the UI.
Yeah.
And so what I just described is that the REST-based UI from WCF and the MVC UI from ASP.NET and the Silverlight UI from Silverlight all implemented this stuff.
So, and you're referring to, when you say UI for WCF, you're referring to that end API layer that folks could interact with.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay.
Yep. But because it was all at the UI level, see, Windows Forms predates this idea. So Windows Forms has never understood these things. WPF predates this idea. So WPF didn't understand these things. Xamarin didn't understand these things.
No.
Right. And so what happens here with CSLA, though, is that CSLA, when it goes and caches this property info on the first instantiation of a person type, it also scans through and finds any of these data annotations attributes and caches those.
Ah.
So that means that even in a console app like this or in a Windows Forms app, this rule will in fact run.
Okay.
So
So
these rules, CSLA makes these rules work everywhere, is what I'm saying, whereas they normally would not.
very cool. So now I can have those business objects separate from perhaps the data objects that I'm going to store in the database if I'm hooking up to Entity Framework, and this might be something more that I could use as well for my view models to get that similar enforcement.
Yep.
Cool. Okay.
So that's one way to do a rule. Another way is that rules, at the end of the day, and this is really a concept that comes out of a book titled Object Thinking, written by David West. I think MS Press published it, but David West is a wonderful guy, professor of computer science, and really put a lot of deep thought into object-oriented programming and design.
Okay.
And he in his object thinking book talks about this idea of self-evaluating rules, basically
Okay. Okay.
an object that is a rule, or a type that represents a rule. And so that's what this follows, that exact pattern. So it says, hey, I'm going to create a rule. It's going to actually, it implements iBusiness rule, but it's easier to subclass.
Okay.
It's going to implement an execute method, and in this execute method is the point where we're going to implement the rule itself.
The actual logic of testing and evaluating it.
Yep, exactly. And the rule can be arbitrarily complex, and so it might be as simple as getting the target from the context object here, and because you get provided a context, this is so that it's testable.
Okay.
And we might just say, well, we're going to cast that to a type person. Then we can get the name value off target.name.
Oh, okay.
And or any other properties that I need to do. And now, if these are a bunch of numeric properties, and because I have access to target, or I can get at its parent if it's part of an object graph. I can, like if I'm a line item in a sales order, I can start interacting with the sales order itself, and I have access to the whole object graph.
I see. So you, at this point, you're in the object within that rule context. You have the whole object graph. You have, and because everything's cached, as you were saying earlier, all of that stuff is just accessible quickly in memory. Okay.
Hmm. Yep.
I'm definitely seeing there's some power here that we can go after. Once I evaluate and figure out my rule, the name's minimum length must be greater than 3 or something. I don't know, whatever, right? So that it's not just required, but it needs to be a certain length or whatever your rule might be. How do you enforce? How do you raise that back then as passed or failed the rule check?
Hmm. So there's kind of two big concepts to understand. One is what you just described is a validation rule.
Okay.
Um, and so yeah, basically we could say name.length is greater than 3 in your case, right?
Sure.
Then we're going to say context.add, and here we can say that we'd like to add error results, warning results, information results,
Okay.
or success results. And so in your context, we might say add an error result saying, the name, must be 3 characters or less, something like that.
Okay, that makes sense. All right, I get that. Now, there's another concept?
So that's one concept. And in fact, this there we go. That's a complete, validation rule of sorts. But the other concept is that you could, instead of indicating some sort of just basic success or failure scenario, you could do some sort of here, this might be a good one. Let's do, we want the name to be to upward, right?
Okay.
And so here we can say that add result. We can add an out value.
Okay.
And we can say that the name property should be the name to upper. I think I need to put person.name property. There we go. So now I'm saying that I want to alter. So I'm not just returning success or failure. I'm saying as a result of this rule, I want the rules engine to update the name property with an uppercase version of itself.
So you're giving a way to apply as part of a business rule. Let's mutate the object as a result of this in a
Yes.
standard way. Okay, makes sense.
Yep. And I could add multiple out values. So I can be a rule can change many different properties on an object or even other parts of the object graph.
Okay.
Which kind of comes back to our conversation earlier about how if you change a quantity, it goes on back order, we give you a 10% discount. So the rule might in fact be adding a whole new line item to the sales order to represent that discount or something.
And it's all encapsulated in one class, right? That's good object-oriented design, having all of that logic in one place, one business rule class that now you've got versioned and hopefully in source control, and you're able to see those changes, and it applies uniformly.
Yep, exactly.
Awesome. Okay.
And you should be able to test this, right? Because this is because you can instantiate this as part of a unit test. You pass in a mock set of mock information through the context so that you can make sure it did the right thing and so forth.
Okay. Very cool. That makes a lot of sense to me. Yeah.
And then you have to so this is the other piece of this puzzle, right? That's the rule. That we've got this my rule, but then we also need to attach the rule. So we'll add a rule, which is the new my rule. We'll set its primary property equal to name property.
Okay.
And so now what I've done here is I've said, hey, when name property changes, I want you to run this rule.
Okay. That makes sense. So you've introduced that layer of validation, that layer of standardization around our object, our person object.
Yep.
Cool.
Now, of course, again, we've thrown all best practices out the window here, right? So again,
it's a demo.
in real code, you'd have a lot of your most reusable rules are probably going to be in their own class or maybe even their own DLL. You might have a DLL that just contains the rules that deal with recalculating discounts and taxes or something, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then those are all unit tested, but then you can, or a nice example might be validating a postal code or a phone number.
Oh
Uh,
yeah.
and you might just create a library of rules like that are all tested, they work. And then everywhere that you've got a business object that has a property that's a phone number, you can just attach the validate phone number rule to
Okay.
that,
Yeah.
right?
Now,
Because the idea is that a domain object is constructed based on the domain-driven design principles. Eric Evans's book is a great one to read,
oh yeah.
literally titled Domain-Driven Design. So you design your domain objects, but then this allows you to keep the rules themselves externalized from the domain object, but still attach them where necessary, right?
So I'm torn because the recent versions of ASP.NET Core really push us towards using dependency injection capabilities, right? Inversion of control containers, and I see what you have on line 37, and that feels to me like this is something that I want to be concretely attached to this object, referencing in this case, my rule. It's our name validation rule. But if I've got things like our zip code validation rule sitting in another library, that feels like something I want to concretely attach. Is there a place where dependency injection, where those inversion of control containers fit in here?
In this context, it's not something that I've explored.
Okay.
I'm not. I think the answer is probably yes. However, um, and I won't spend a whole lot of time going into this, but there's a whole other thing here where, um, uh, 10.1, where this can support what are called rule sets, because if you're creating a multi-tenant server scenario, you might have completely different rules for tenant one versus tenant two.
Oh my gosh, yes. Oh
And
yes.
and again, so it's not to say that a dependency injection model wouldn't fit that, but it would be pretty interesting to figure out how to get AutoFac to instantiate my rule in different ways for different tenants all at the same time.
Right.
Because
Oh.
again, all of this stuff that we're talking about here, this executes exactly once the first time the person type gets instantiated at the very beginning of your app, and then is cached forever during the lifetime of the app domain. Because you don't want to be loading these rules over and over again, because especially if you're loading multiple rule sets for different tenants,
Yeah.
that's not cheap. So you need to do it once and then keep it around, right?
Sure. Oh my
Um,
gosh.
So yeah, so I mean, there's some reasonably sophisticated stuff going on here, and I'm not saying that dependency injection doesn't necessarily have a role, but I'm also not. I mean, that's a tool. It's not the only tool.
Right. It doesn't feel like the right one for managing these rules. And the multi-tenant scenario hits home for me because um right long time ago, before I worked at Telerik and now Microsoft. I worked in multi-tenant application scenarios, and we did all of our business rules by doing tests against fields in a database. Is this property set true? Okay, then we're going to go execute this logic. If that property set true, then we're going to pivot and go this way. To have it codified like this is extremely powerful.
Right. Yep. And and if you look at this, and it's not so trivial, but all of this could have been pulled out of a database, right? The type name, my rule, the property to attach it to, and the tenant name. And so the reality is that if you are in a multi-tenant scenario with complicated rules, probably the rules are being loaded either from some config file or a database table.
Mm-hmm.
And again, they get loaded once, and cached, but the definitions of these rules are probably not hard-coded like I'm showing here,
Oh, sure.
right? So, simpler applications, they're often hard-coded, and then in these simplest scenarios, you use things like the data annotations attributes.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But
Those
one of
ones
the
that,
drawbacks, one of the drawbacks to those is they're compiled in, so that required attribute can't be turned on or off by tenant or anything.
right, right. In the chat room, Standby Reloading says AutoFax supports keyed registration. It's easy to support tenant diffs. Okay,
Ah,
there you go.
wonderful. That's good to know.
Yeah. So, all right. So we have a person object here. How do we create this person then and see that business rule being enforced?
So let's go up here to our console app, and we'll do. And so what you might think is, oh, I'm going to go, p equals new person.
Mm-hmm.
That'd be the simple way to do this.
Sure.
But there's a better way. Part of the problem with doing this is that I've worked in so many different application scenarios where when you create a new instance of an object, you actually have to load default values from the database.
Sure. Oh my gosh,
So,
yes.
so creating an object is really no different than retrieving an existing one. It's just you are getting a new object that has default values instead of concrete values, if that makes any sense.
Yeah.
So CSLA has this abstraction for creating and retrieving objects, and that's called the data portal. So we say I'd like to have the data portal, and we want it to create an instance of person. And so what happens here is that in the simplest case, it just goes out and gets a blank person, very much like new. And so to make that happen, in fact, in the person class, right here, we'll override data portal create. And so here we can say something like name is equal to Fred. That
Okay.
would be default loaded from database or something like that, right?
That makes sense. Okay. So when at what point does that overrided data portal create method get called? Right? Is it constructor and then that method?
So yeah, what happens is that the data portal is really quite sophisticated in a lot of different ways, not least of which is when this data portal create gets called, this is really on the client code, right? This is our quote unquote UI.
Sure.
It looks at the configuration of the client and says, hey, is the quote unquote server side code running locally or remotely?
Okay.
Based on configuration. And if it's running locally, then it calls the data portal right there on the client device. Or if it's running remotely, then it looks to find a URL or some other address for the server. And if they're, and then it remotes it to the server. So the call actually goes across the network and executes on your app server or web server, whatever it might be.
Makes sense.
Looking at the code, you can't tell the difference. It's all based on configuration changes. So this is something called location transparency, where the code exists independent of physical topology. That's a bunch of big words to say that one of the things that I've run into numerous times in my career is something I call the pit of success.
Yes. Right. The physical topology is something that gosh, some of it we take for granted at times.
Yeah.
Right. This is my server layout. This is physics of how things are, the physical location of things. But when you don't have to think about that, it feels like there's a lot of freedom at that point, right? And our friends who are using containers a lot, they get that freedom They completely understand that because everything's now virtual to them.
Yeah, containers are awesome.
Well, I can't disagree with that. Um, I'm,
But I mean, the thing is this: the idea is that so often, so many of us get asked to, some business person comes in and says, "Oh, we're migrating from system A to system B, and it's going to take us like 2 years to get there. So in the 6 months in between, we just need a stopgap thing.
mm-hmm.
We've got like 5 users. If you can whip up this small app that will meet these 5 users' needs. We don't care. They're just all sitting down the hall in one spot. We don't need scalability. We don't need nothing. We just need it fast and cheap."
I'm waiting for the other shoe to drop, Rocky. I'm waiting for it to drop.
And you implement that, and then maybe even a year later, you get this panicked phone call at 3 in the morning, and they're going, "Hey, our users in Taiwan are down. We need your help now."
There it
And you're like,
was.
"Users in Taiwan? What the hell?"
And this
And
happens.
and it's because
Oh.
those 5 users loved your app so much that they canceled the big migration from A to B and instead rolled your app out globally.
Yeah.
And now it's being used by 100 people in 8 different offices, and you designed it to run for 5 people and of course it's falling down. And in so many cases, what happens there is you're like, "Oh, well, now we're going to have to re-architect the thing because we wrote it for a 2-tier physical topology. We need to change it to a 3-tier or service-oriented, model. We wrote the first thing in 6 weeks, but now it's going to take a team of 3 people 6 months." And the business people look at you like you're a horrible, evil monster that doesn't know what the hell you're doing because, but what the data portal does, in short, is it allows you to make out as though this is a really big, complicated thing. It's, "Oh man, I'm going to need a raise to get this done." Um,
Go ahead.
but But all you really need to do is stand up an app server, which takes like 10 minutes or less with Azure or with containers or whatever,
Mm-hmm.
and change the client side configuration to talk to the server instead of talking locally. And now you switched from a 2-tier to a 3-tier model, and all of the stability, reliability issues, scaling, everything else just disappears. Basically, you can fix everything in about half an hour, is what I'm saying.
And then get to the golf course.
Exactly, and don't tell anybody, right? This is the real key here, is you don't tell you make out like it's super hard and you're working on it while you're golfing. That's exactly right.
So these things that we've learned in enterprise development over over many years, and when we guarantee that yes, for these metrics, for this scope, this application will work, and getting burned by some business person who says, "Ah, it's fine, we can put a couple extra users on this." You've built the abstraction in to solve that scope growing problem with just a little bit of configuration and standing up another service. Nice. And I can't tell you to hear that in the world of consulting, hearing that scope creep. And it's not even it's scope creep that you didn't even see. It was something that somebody went and just added in and said, we'll add more folks to this. We'll expand the usage of this. We'll open up our Amazon Prime Day and have millions of people be able to access this all at once.
Yep.
And then everybody does access it.
Yep. Tell
And
me
now
this
what?
doesn't happen to everybody at some
It
point, right?
it, it it's everybody. There is no boundary to this. Everybody falls victim to this at some point. So, yeah, how do you expand quickly and easily? And I love that you've got an object that allows you to expand by adding configuration, standing up a server that supports that. Okay.
So let's see if I typoed anything here. Um, I very easily could have this coding on the fly stuff. It's there we go. So
Okay.
So running this app, I see that I probably do have a problem because we didn't unit test that rule at all. But so I've got the name of the object is Fred, and
Be-
it's
because that was the default name that you put out there.
right, and and it turns out that the object has what's called metastate.
Okay.
And so one of the pieces of metastate here is valid, right?
Okay.
And so you can ask the domain object, are you currently valid? Do you have any broken rules right now?
Sure.
And you can also ask it, are you savable? Which is a different question, interestingly enough.
So that's like that dirty flag that a lot of us would put on our objects. This has been changed. It should be saved at some point.
Yep. Oh, it's even, yeah. So that's also true. So if we, there's is dirty, which it turns out, and I came up with this name back in who knows, the 90s, in the COM version of CSLA. But culturally, I learned much later that I should have gone with like has changed or is changed or something, because apparently in some cultures the term dirty actually is like unclean.
Oh.
So, whoops. It just shows how cultural sensitivity matters, I guess is what I'm saying.
Yes. So peeking under the covers, the first time that I saw some of the rules around building APIs at Microsoft, there are rules around using red and green to indicate success and failure, because in some cultures, red's not a bad thing. Or
Wow.
right right when we talk about relationships between two servers, right, you might have a primary and a secondary. Some folks used to call those master and slave. That's not terms we should use when we need to
Mm-hmm.
be sensitive around other cultures. So primary, secondary is right. Those types. It's weird to have to think about that when you do have something that's an API that you're building that's going to be internationally accepted, right?
Yep. Yep.
So,
And if I knew back then what I know now, of course I would have named it differently. But then since I didn't, now I end up in this deal where it's like, wow, I could change the name, but I would break thousands and thousands of apps in the world that have been built on CSLA. So is it really worth it, right?
yes. Oh my gosh. Yes. There's the framework developer's nightmare is, do I really change this piece of functionality? What's it going to break?
So for fun now, since we've got this, let's actually do p.name equals just an empty string,
Okay.
because that should be a broken rule, right? And so
Right.
now,
We said it's required.
so if we run this, now we can see that the object is valid. It's not valid. It is changed, and it's not savable.
So we've added that rule into the mix, and all of these things, it's doing the evaluation for us behind the scenes. We haven't had to write any tests or anything like that. We're just getting these properties for free, effectively.
That's right. Yep.
Awesome. All right, I get it. Thanks so much to all of our new followers that have been chiming in here. I know I haven't acknowledged you, but we're learning some cool stuff with Rocky Lhotka here today from Magenic about CSLA. All right.
So
So
if we could, let's actually move on to a more
complex example?
more complex example,
Fantastic. Please.
something that will actually also show some of the cross-platform capabilities. And so,
And to some of the folks in the chat room that joined me for some of our other projects, we're working on a very simple wiki project that we've been trying to figure out. Here, there's some business rules to these things. There's some workflow we may want to add in the future, and some of the things you're showing us might be very applicable to that project that we're working on other shows here. So I'm really excited seeing what you've got here for us.
awesome. So I think this is working. I'm zooming in. I
Oh
hope I
yeah.
didn't screw up your resolutions at all.
Oh yeah. It looks really good.
Okay. So this is the reference app for CSLA. So this is when you go to the GitHub repo, under the samples folder, there's a project tracker.
Okay.
And And this is much more what I would think of as normal. So we've got a UI or presentation layer, we've got a data access layer, we've got a business layer, and then we've also got an app server, which is literally nothing except the host for the, there's no code in it. It's just a host for endpoints on the app server.
Okay.
Hopefully that made some sense.
Oh, yeah.
And so if we look at the business library, now here I'll talk a little bit about that .NET bug, which is hopefully going to go away soon.
Yes.
So and it's obscure, but here's the scoop. CSLA relies on serialization to do some of what it does. And in the serialization namespace, there are some attributes to help you control serialization, such as not serialized. And not serialized somehow didn't get type forwarded in full.NET. So if you reference a net standard DLL that uses the not serialized attribute and then run that DLL or host it in full.NET, it will in fact fail.
Okay.
And so because CSLA uses that one attribute, what it means is that at the moment in NuGet, there are two packages for CSLA. There's CSLA-core, which supports full.NET, and there's CSLA-core-NS that supports everything else.
Makes sense. All right.
And yeah, but it's a mess because now if you want to have the same business logic running on the client and the server, which is kind of part of what CSLA lets you do, it means that you have to compile that code. So here's the code. It's in a shared project.
Okay.
Which, for those that have not seen shared projects, they don't compile. They are literally just a repository for code file or for code.
Mm-hmm.
And then I have the full.NET project that has no code in it, but references that shared library.
Okay.
So when businesslibrary.net gets built, it actually compiles all of those code files. And it compiles them for .NET 4.6.2 or something.
Okay.
Right? And then I also have a businesslibrary.net standard that similarly references the same shared class library.
Okay.
And so it also compiles all the same code, but this time it creates a DLL that targets net standard.
Gotcha. So, right, to make sure everybody follows that, instead of inside Visual Studio, inside other project systems, you can add objects as a link, right? I can say add a link to this C# file or this VB file inside this other project. By using a shared library, it's lifting everything that a shared project. It's lifting the entire contents of that and dropping it in wherever it's referenced.
Exactly.
Okay.
And so literally I'm compiling the exact same code 2 times.
Yeah.
Once for full.NET and a second time for net standard. The only reason I'm doing this is because we can't use net standard DLLs in full.NET if they use that serializable attribute.
Wow.
Or not serialized.
Okay.
I heard a rumor that .NET 4.7.2 might fix this problem, so I hope that's true.
You know what? That wasn't a part of .NET that I was working on. I was in System Web and also System.Services, and that's
So
not me.
You're saying not my fault. That's what I'm hearing.
No, I'm saying I wasn't in that area of the framework, but I'm going to dodge that bullet there slightly. All right.
I'm with you on that. I'm with you. So
All right.
the point being that here I've got a whole bunch of classes.
Oh yeah.
That are just like, they're more complicated versions of what we were just walking through, right? They have properties, they got rules, and so on and so forth. And I'm just compiling them so that the .NET version can run in the app server, which is full .NET. and the net standard version can run in things like Xamarin and UWP and so forth.
Yeah. Now, let me ask you a question. This is a good question from the chat room from I think that's Emor, asking could you try multi-targeting inside your .NET Standard project instead of using the shared project?
Maybe, and I say maybe because I think, yeah, the answer is probably true because you could use compiler directives to block out the. Yeah, maybe. I'm not 100% sure on that. That'd be
Okay.
fun to try. That'd be fun to try.
Yeah.
The better answer, honestly, is once .NET gets, it's just a type forwarding attribute that's missing.
Okay.
Right. So once that gets added in full .NET, yay, then it's just all going to work, because the correct, like, ultimate goal here is that all we need to do is support net standard.
Right. Right.
Right.
And when we build new class libraries, we should be building Net Standard 2.0 or whatever the current version is, and focus on just that. We shouldn't, unless we need something specific to that framework, we shouldn't be building specific to some .NET framework. We should target, particularly for business objects, .NET Standard.
Totally agree. Yeah, 100%.
Yeah.
And really, even my app server, I could run .NET Core. My problem is that Windows Forms and WPF both run on full .NET at the moment, and so I'm kind of stuck.
I
Right?
like how you said that.
Well, Net Standard 3 is going to make life better even there, right? So,
Right.
the future is bright. That's what I'm saying.
It
Right?
is, right? The amount of investment in these platforms to make it easier and simpler to build across, right? It's the from 64K to 64 gig problem. How do we have one programming language that can help us target everything?
Yes.
And we're getting there.
And so, given just that little background, I guess I'll launch the Windows Forms app just because it's fun to look back on the past.
Where we came from.
Well, that, and if we're honest with ourselves, like, almost half of the .NET code still out there is Windows Forms, I think, right? 40% or something.
There's a crazy amount out there, yes. and the number of folks that every Monday morning file a new project and they create a new one-off accounting project in Windows Forms. It's out there, absolutely.
So I'm going to run this. I'll zoom in a little because see how that looks. And now I'm not going to log in to start with.
Okay.
Because it makes for a better demo. And so here's my awesome gray battleship gray UI.
The military loves it that way.
And and so when I click on some of these menu items, notice that some of the options are in fact grayed out. They're not available. And even here, what we're seeing is a separation between business logic and the user experience. And so the rule that the current user, who's an anonymous user, the current user can't create new projects or delete projects. And that those rules are in the business layer. They're actually written into the project edit class. And what's happening here is that the UI, in order to give the user a good experience, the Windows UI is asking the business layer, hey, if the user wanted to create a new project, could they? And the answer is no, so it grays out the menu item.
So you have your permissions built into this business logic class.
Correct, because that's business logic.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so the UI is responsive. The UI is making the user experience good, but it doesn't really know why. The rules aren't written into the UI. Just the knowledge. The rules are written into the business DLL. But there's this dialogue that goes back and forth. So we get a good user experience. And the same thing here. If I open up and look at a project, all of the forms or the controls here are read-only, because the current user is not allowed to edit anything.
Right. Okay. They're
And
not logged
again,
in.
the UI doesn't know the rules. The UI is just asking the business layer, can the current user edit the name? Can the current user edit the started date and so forth? But if I log in now as a manager, so now all of these things light up.
Right. I noticed the buttons on the right side lit
Yep,
up as well. Makes
same
sense.
thing. Yeah, and so now if I blank this field, I get turns out it's a required field. Get the project name is required as a tooltip will show up when I hover over it. And none of this detail is in the UI. Right? This is all happening through data binding.
Okay.
So when I cleared the field and tabbed out of the name text box, data binding took the now empty string value, put it into the business domain object. The domain object said, oh, that property changed, so it ran all of the rules that are attached to that property, which includes the required rule. Then the property became invalid at that point because it ran those rules.
Yeah.
And then through the data binding interfaces, the domain object reports back to the UI, hey, this property is not good. Here's why. And then the UI just displays the tooltip. But even the tooltip came out of the domain object, not out of the UI.
It's just data bound over there.
That's correct.
Very cool. Alan Conway in the chat room quotes the MSDN blog that says .NET Core 3 supports Windows desktop applications, specifically Windows Forms, WPF, and UWP XAML. Yes. You will be able to run new and existing Windows desktop applications on .NET Core and enjoy all the benefits .NET Core has to offer. I think more importantly, it comes back to what we were saying just a little bit ago, that as a framework developer, you worry about changing interface and breaking things. And when we see Windows Forms go to .NET Core 3, some of those things that we've learned can be applied, and we can effectively fix Windows Forms without breaking everybody, because you're on a completely different framework at that point. Not just, oh, it's .NET Framework X version, some number greater than 4.7.2 that people are just going to upgrade their applications to without thinking twice about it. And Brave Cobra says missing Linux and Mac support there. Well, actually, you can do that with Xamarin, Xamarin Forms, right?
Just give us time.
It's coming, right?
So the last thing I want to show here in the Windows Forms UI is just that here's a slightly more sophisticated validation rule, just to make that more dramatic. So if I try to end the project before it starts, notice that both the started and ended properties become invalid. And so we've got, this is just demonstrating rules that transcend property boundaries. So changing either of these properties, if I say, oh, it actually started back in 2009, that is all
clears it out.
Clearing it out.
Right? So you showed us how to add an error in that business rule. So you're effectively adding two errors here because they're in the wrong order.
Yep, it's okay. one rule that's marking two different properties as being invalid because they're related to each other.
Makes sense. Okay.
All right. So let's get to the. I'll in the interest of people's, this UWP, WPF. That's all Windows. Everybody's like, yeah, we know .NET runs on Windows. I want to show this one just because even I got no stake in this company. It's a commercial product, but one of the a gentleman named Tiago, who's one of the biggest CSLA contributors, contributed this thing that uses something called WiseJ, and I think it's so freaking amazing that I just got to show it quick, because what this is a commercial product that will take your Windows Forms UI and render it in HTML.
Whoa.
I know, I know. It's
Okay.
mind-boggling. And so this is in the browser, right? This is HTML,
Yeah.
but notice how it's the same user experience
Yeah.
that I had because it's actually the Windows Forms code. I'll basically walk through the same demo. Just if I log in, I guess I don't really want to save that password. But then if I tab out, notice that I get the
You get the
tool.
same experience.
Yeah, I know, it boggles my mind.
Wow. That's really cool. Okay. So,
I'm not trying to sell their product or anything. It's like,
no, that's okay. Yeah, there are how many folks out there, like you were saying, with Windows Forms apps all over the place, and to be able to put it into a framework, into and deploy it to as a web application, that's pretty cool. So,
so,
all right, you've got Android there. I see you
so I
highlighted.
got Android. Actually, I've got it already installed on my phone, so we won't reinstall it, I don't think. But um, so this is actually my real phone. You know, emulators are fine, I guess, but at the if I can control this thing with my mouse, though. Um, at the end of the day, though, there's nothing beats
Nothing beats hardware. Yeah.
hard. Yeah, um, and especially I'll show the Mac or the iOS stuff in a second, and that's even more important. But slightly different user experience, but the same basic idea here. Whoops. Yeah, I'm running a free version here of this, and for some reason it is being mean to me. Where in this case, because you don't really get tooltips and hoverovers on phones, but
Mm-hmm.
notice that the name label turned red because it's a required field, and so it's same DLL running behind the scenes is what I'm getting at, right?
Sure.
Or if I switch over to my Mac, and so here we'll get into something that's a little more fun, maybe, in that. So here's my iPhone emulator
Mm-hmm.
because I don't have an iPhone; I have an Android phone. But we get the um, same behavior here. Because this is Xamarin Forms, it's actually the same app, right?
Sure.
Same UI and the same
The same business logic.
business logic.
Nice.
What's interesting about working with iOS, though, is that code will run on the emulator that will not run on a real device. And that's because
Oh,
this iPhone thing is not an emulator; it's a simulator,
right.
and it's not in fact running on emulated hardware. So it doesn't even use the same version of Mono, or at least the same configuration of Mono as you get on a real device.
Oh man. Okay.
And so if you're doing if you're doing Xamarin work and targeting iOS, you absolutely positively really 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 have to have an actual device.
I bet. Yeah.
um, the simulator is cute, but it doesn't get you anywhere. So and I haven't installed Project Tracker, but here's another CSLA app called whoops, I guess I don't. So this is running on a real iPad,
Okay.
and I'm displaying the iPad using the QuickTime recording, which Jeff, you and I were talking about before the webcast. But
Yeah.
this is a really cool hack where on my Mac I'm running the QuickTime player, and
Yep.
then I say that I'd like to record a video, and you can then say I want to record it from my iPad, which is connected to my Mac via a cable.
Mm-hmm.
So now I can interact with my iPad, but everybody gets to see it on the screen.
Right. It's a great way to give demos of showing things being built for those devices, whether it's the phone or the iPad. So,
Um, and this is a slightly different app from the Project Tracker. This is in fact a real app, whereas I guess Project Tracker is too, but Project Tracker is a reference app. If I go back to my browser, I just want to plug this for a second because this is a project that I'm coordinating along with the Humanitarian Toolbox
Okay.
called the Mobile Kids ID Kit. And anybody out there who's interested in Xamarin and CSLA type work and wants to make the world a better place for kids might want to consider getting involved in this project.
So open source code,
Yep.
building an
Open source.
application to help find kids.
Yep. Yep. That's exactly what it is.
Yeah, right. Open source projects are a great way for folks to learn new technologies, to see exactly how experts and other people write code and learn from that and get feedback as they contribute. So, and to make a difference on a project like that, that's a huge thing. So I'll make sure we grab that link as well, and we'll attach that to the show notes here.
And so this is, definitely a work in progress, but we're pretty much at the point where we're about to put it out into some beta testing and get user feedback. And basically, it's a way of allowing parents to keep all of their data about their kids up to date on their phones. So if their kids ever unfortunately did go missing, everything that they would need to report to the police or child agencies like Missing Children Minnesota and so forth would all be right there and easily accessible.
Okay.
And this is all written using Xamarin Forms and CSLA and some other tech. So it's kind of cool stuff.
And Xamarin Forms, another open source technology. If you have Visual Studio Community, you can work with Xamarin Forms. You won't be able to deploy to a device, but you can build and learn how to use it. Am I right? Right, the licensing there is.
No, I think you can even deploy to devices. You certainly can deploy to the emulators. I think you can.
Yes. Right, there's a thing where at some point you need to be in the Apple program to deploy to an iPad. Android you can deploy to.
That's right. Yeah, so to do what I'm doing, running this on an actual iPad, I have an Apple developer license, which is $100 a year or something like that.
Yep.
But yeah, for Android, if I bring up my my Android phone, I've got the Missing Kids ID app here as well somewhere. Well, I don't think we care too much, but the point being,
you can learn, you can deploy to your own device if you have an Android device, all for free. So it's a great way to get started if you want to learn more about the project and contribute. No cost for anybody who wants to learn how to build mobile apps.
Now, somebody in the chat window I know had mentioned Mac and Linux, and although I guess I'm going to skip demoing this, but I just want to be clear that using Visual Studio or Visual Studio Code on the Mac and using Xamarin and .NET Core and CSLA, you can write, in fact, especially if you're using Xamarin Forms, it directly supports Mac OS. And so you can use Xamarin to create Mac or Linux user experiences. And because that's all using net standard compliant code, then CSLA works there. Everything that I've shown you in this webcast, you can do on a Mac. You don't need Windows at all anymore.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
Do the whole darn thing on the Mac. You can do, in fact, you can even do all your development on Linux if you want to, because VS Code runs on Linux, .NET Core runs there, and Xamarin has GTK Plus support as a UI, so you can use Xamarin to create GTK Plus apps on Linux as well.
Right. GTK Plus is that user interface framework for Linux and the GNOME desktop and some other, right, it works in some other desktops as well. Imor writes, you only need Windows for UWP. Well, WPF and Windows Forms as well.
Right. Yep.
So,
but and I think there's a couple more things I want to show, and in the interest of time, so because we've been talking about Smart Client. The reality is that a lot of folks do create web web apps, and there's a couple different kinds of web app that you might create. One of which, and this is a different. Once you start getting hooked into nonprofits and doing some work, then it's like there's unlimited amounts of opportunities to make nonprofit life better, right?
Oh gosh,
This
yes.
this is another thing that I'm working on, just to collect and analyze data about cases, and all of this is fake data, um, but this is a simple MVC website. So this is
Okay.
using ASP.NET Core, nothing special on the client, and but I can go in and edit all this information. All of this is backed by a CSLA object with rules and so on and so forth. But this is just a standard Razor based. In fact, I'm using Razor Pages, which is this new and I think awesome way of creating MVC apps.
That page first way of developing that our friends who use PHP are familiar with, right? Being able to interweave our C# in our case with the markup is for a page focused application, and for that mindset feels so easy to do.
Yep. So this is the Razor page, for that edit screen that we were just looking at. I don't have to create a controller or anything, because the Razor page model, it's not like the controllers aren't there. It's just that I don't have to write what amounts to it. If you think about the old way of doing Razor with MVC, every controller was essentially the same stuff over and over again.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
well, I mean, if you did it right, people often put business logic in the controller, but that's wrong. So
You end up with fat controllers then, right?
yeah, so this is actually, in my mind, maybe better because, but yeah, there's code behind, and the code behind the page is basically all about figuring out what you're going to expose as bindable public properties.
Mm-hmm.
And then
Mm-hmm.
because we're using CSLA, it's basically just going out and using the data portal to retrieve all of the different uh, objects that are being displayed.
So that was actually going to be my next question for you is when you're in this model, when you're in the Razor Pages model and you're not returning a business object like you would in MVC, right? In MVC from your controller, you would return some sort of a model object that we're going to bind to inside of our Razor template, inside of our view. Here, it sounds like, and it looks like, you've made the page model, which is that view model we expose in Razor Pages, into a CSLA object, business object, that has the rules and things bound to it right here.
Well, the thing is that ASP-MVC and Razor Pages have their own data binding mechanisms,
Mm-hmm.
and they use most of the same interfaces and behaviors as Smart Client stuff does. And so CSLA domain objects support binding to MVC and web forms for those that still do that. Um,
We
so
love web forms.
yeah. um, but the point, yeah, and there's a ton of web forms out there.
There is.
So, but yeah, so CSLA fully supports the MVC model and the web forms model, and all the data binding that goes with that as well. Um, and not only just like in this case to retrieve the data, but also when we do a post, and here I'm telling the case edit domain object that it should get saved asynchronously. And that's also behind the scenes using the CSLA data portal, running the CSLA, all the validation rules. Any of those rules are automatically displayed back through the data binding mechanism for ASP MVC, because MVC has its own, again, if we look at the page, there's all of these lines here that are doing ASP validation for.
Yep.
That stuff all sits on top of data binding as well.
Mm-hmm.
And so all the rules that are built into your domain objects automatically show up in the postback if a rule gets violated, the object doesn't get saved and the user is notified as to why, just like in Windows Forms and everything else.
Right, we end up with model errors being raised here that get trapped and displayed on
Yep.
thast
Yep.
validation for attributes.
So all the rules that are built into your domain object DLL, again, the same rules that work on Windows Forms and WPF and Xamarin apply here. They just get rendered by MVC instead of being displayed in a XAML or whatever else way. Now, where this falls down, and honestly, is if you turn around and you say, "Okay, Rocky, yeah, that's cute, but I don't do that anymore. I write all of my web stuff in Angular," and
Yeah.
that's where it falls down, because in that context, really what you're doing is you're writing architecturally, you're writing two different apps. You're writing a smart client app using TypeScript and Angular, and you're writing server-side services that support it. And there is no TypeScript version of CSLA. So you can't run the CSLA stuff in the browser with Angular, right?
Is that an opportunity for a group to contribute?
Well, it might be, and I wouldn't turn that down if somebody wants to go into that approach. However, there's this other thing, and this is the last big demo that I wanted to show, called Blazor.
Yes. Okay.
So I'm not confident that it matters, and maybe I'm overly optimistic, but there's this thing called WebAssembly that not everybody knows about, but we should, because WebAssembly is currently shipping in all major browsers today, and it's turned on.
And everybody's kind of been forced to upgrade their browsers because of our friends, right? Spectre and Meltdown. Everybody had to upgrade their browser. Guess what? You've got this.
Yeah, if you've got Chrome, Firefox, Edge, Safari, you've got WebAssembly.
Yeah.
And to be clear, what WebAssembly is in the browser, there's HTML, CSS, and then there's the JavaScript engine that runs code in the browser. And all that has happened here is that nestled right alongside the JavaScript engine is an assembly language engine. And it does the same thing, fills the same niche as JavaScript. But instead of writing JavaScript code, you can write assembly language code and have it behind your HTML, just like JavaScript. And in fact, you can have both. You can have just JavaScript, or you can have just WebAssembly.
Now, this is different from what you showed us just a few minutes ago, where you had Windows Forms in the browser, right? It was actually rendering HTML and CSS to make it look like Windows Forms. This is different.
This is very different, because this is actual assembly language code running on the client in the browser. Whereas that YSJ thing was running all of the code on the server and just sending HTML to be rendered in the browser.
Right. Okay.
So it was all server-side code. But what we're talking about here with Blazor, or with WebAssembly, is 100% client-side code. So in January, well, first, just to be clear, so WebAssembly is not a Microsoft thing. It originally comes out of the Mozilla Foundation. And they started by making C and C++ compile to WebAssembly, and to now also Go and Rust compile to WebAssembly.
Yep.
And in January, the Xamarin team got Mono running or compiling so that it runs in WebAssembly.
So, Mono, the framework that folks use to build stuff for Linux and Mac, compiling down and shipping as a web thing is huge.
Absolutely. And I mean, this is all happening because we're talking January, right? 6 months ago. Subsequent to that, the ASP.NET team, Jeff Sandquist in particular, was like, oh man, we could take the Razor rendering engine.
I think you mean Steve Sanderson.
Or Sanderson, sorry, thank you.
Wrong Sand.
Sometimes I get confused. And we can take the Razor rendering engine that normally runs on a web server, and we could make it run on the client in the browser.
Yeah.
And that is evolved into what's called Blazor, which is an open source project that you can see right here. It's on GitHub, and you can go. That's got a vibrant community.
Oh yeah, a lot of people talking about this.
There's also a gentleman who on his Twitter goes Preclarum.
Yep, Frank.
Frank Kruger.
Yep.
Created a thing called OOUI.
Yep.
And that is Xamarin Forms running in WebAssembly on the client. And there's another product out there, open source deal called Uno, which is UWP running in WebAssembly. So again, I want to reinforce this is client-side code running in a browser.
Yeah.
And so and I've got just because Blazor's changing so fast, I haven't invested a huge amount, but I did invest enough to get CSLA compiling and working in WebAssembly in Blazor. And so what will happen here is I'm going to I know that we gotta get it off to the side so everybody can see here.
Oh, I resized. You're good.
Oh, okay. So this is the Blazor default sample, and it did talk to a web server, but it talked to the web server only to download the DLLs that are running in the browser. Okay, and in fact, the server doesn't even have to be ASP.NET. It could be a file server. So there's instructions out there if you want to just host your Blazor or your Blazor apps on like GitHub or something. You can totally do that. All you need is a file server.
Hosted on Apache, Nginx, whatever.
Yep. Except in this particular case, if I click Edit Person, now it's running some CSLA code that used the data portal to talk to the app server, which is the web server.
Okay.
So it actually made a service call to retrieve loop cage with a ID 123, somebody first name, last name. And then I can update, and it is round tripping and updating the data in the database on the server. Again, very, very simple, but it's the same behind the scenes. It's the same CSLA code that we've been talking about this whole time.
So, right, all of that .NET standard portability that you've been building for enables the new environment, the new framework, with a little bit of tweaking, and getting it to run out there is, for you as an enterprise application developer, becomes, I'm pushing the same business objects everywhere.
Yep. And in fact, if you think back to the project tracker, how I had essentially I had a business layer, a client UI, and a server. And I think this is so cool because this structure of client, server, and business layer is exactly the default Blazor template. Right? And of course, this is stuff I've been talking about for
years,
20 plus years.
Yeah.
As it's like, here's the client code. This is all .NET code that's literally running in the browser. That's the actual app. Here's the server code, which is primarily exists to deploy the server, except that in here there is a data portal controller.
Okay.
That's the service I'm calling. And then here's my person edit class, which if I kind of zoom back out here, you can see this person edit inherits from business base, has the same kind of properties we were talking about before, and so forth.
Yeah, it looks just like the little sample person that you scaffolded at the beginning.
Yep, that's exactly. And so I can't tell you how excited I am, right? Because now we're talking, I can run my .NET Core server in Docker on Linux.
Sure.
And I can build a client app that runs in WebAssembly and runs on every platform via the browser.
Put that into another Docker container that's just Nginx and just spitting out those static files.
Yep.
Yeah.
And then if I still want a true native iOS and Android experience, Xamarin Forms gets me there. But I get to reuse my business DLL, that same exact business logic. Thanks to CSLA, I get to run it everywhere, right?
Oh yeah.
The future is just, I can't tell you how excited I am.
It's the .NET investments that we're seeing from the team and from the open source community is really allowing us as programmers to take our code to new places, to just enable folks everywhere. We've got a couple questions in the chat room that I think we should answer real quick, if you don't mind.
Sure.
The first question from Brave Cobra 2 is, how does CSLA fit in with a DDD architecture, a domain-driven design architecture?
So the depending on how you define domain-driven design, right? If you strictly say that the only way to do domain-driven design implementation is the way that Eric Evans does it,
Okay.
first off, I think you kind of missed the point. But second off, yeah, that his approach and my approach are not identical. We both wrote our books at the same time, actually, back in the 90s, and didn't know each other at the time. So it would have been kind of cool had we collaborated. But his concepts around the domain-driven design part, not the repository patterns and so forth, but just the how do you design a domain-driven object model?
Yeah.
That's spot on. I mean, and so the idea of creating your domain objects based on user scenarios or user stories, and implementing the if you followed Eric Evans's philosophy, then you would have never needed view models, I guess is a good way to
Yeah.
put it, because your
Okay.
objects would have already been in the right shape. And that's the same if you followed the CSLA philosophy, too. If you design your domain objects correctly, you never need view models because your domain objects are in the right shape. And CSLA helps you do that in a slightly different way from what Eric did, because I focused a lot more on the rules and the rules engine and the location transparency aspects, and he focused on different areas. But they're philosophically very, very, very much in sync.
Cool. All right. Moving along, there's a follow-up question. How would you version your objects? If there's an older client talking to a newer server, do you force an update between the various projects in that case?
This particular problem is not unique to CSLA. It's a
Sure.
general concern. And as such, the general answer is that, yeah, you try to force an update within some reasonable time frame. And as you version the objects, you also version your API endpoint. So normally your API endpoint will include the version number in the URL. And so, yeah, and from a business logic perspective, that part's not too bad, right? Because I have, my server /v1/service endpoint and my server /v2/service endpoint. And as you release V2 of your client app, it talks to V2 of the service. Where it gets complicated, of course, is when the database has to support both at the same time. And
Yes.
so it's not the difficulty here isn't at the app layer or even the app server layer. It's at the database layer, and that problem is as old as my career, which is sadly or happily 30 years now. I mean, it is an old problem.
It is. It's an old problem that just continues.
Yeah, so I wish I had a silver bullet for the database end of it, but at least on the app end of it, and normally, especially in today's world where everything's being deployed through stores or click once or web servers or whatever, getting people or forcing people to update within what I would consider a relatively short time frame, right, a few weeks, that's not usually too challenging. You build it into your app to say, hey, if I'm older than one version behind, I just won't run anymore. And that's, most people don't have a problem with that, but really the trick is that database level. If you start changing the database schema.
Yeah, if you start changing it, then all bets are off, right? You quickly run into other additional challenges. All right. I think that's all the time we have today. Was there something else? I know that was the last demo you wanted to cover. Is there anything else that we need to cover here?
I don't think so.
We're good. Yeah.
Tons of stuff. Again, come back to love the vibrant community that CSLA's got, and if you want to get involved, by all means. There's we use GitHub as a forum, and so there's actually a CSLA forum. We also use Gitter as a chat area.
Oh yeah,
which has become very, very common and popular. So if you want to get involved and learn this, I think also you'd mentioned adding, so the various other URLs. I don't know if you're going to add that on a website or whatever.
yeah. Oh yeah, we'll add those to the description. We'll add the links down below the video here, also on YouTube.
Yep.
So there you go. CSLA store, store.lhotka.net.
Yep. So videos and books, ebooks, that cover a lot of this stuff, and the community is, I think, really very welcoming and open, and we love to have people involved, and have often some really good conversations. So
very healthy too. It sounds like.
Yes.
Awesome. All right. Well, that's 2 hours. I think that's a show. Thank you so much for joining me, Rocky. This has been great. I really learned a lot about CSLA here. I think there's an opportunity for us to talk about using this with our core wiki project. Ancient Coder, you're catching us right here at the end of the show. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to archive off this video. It'll be over on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/C#Fritz. You'll find it over there. It'll be here in the videos section on Twitch for about 30 to 60 days. And we'll put those links to the CSLA store, to the CSLA project, so you can get all that stuff that you need if you want to get started, you want to try out and start using CSLA with your project. All right. I hope everybody comes back and joins me on Thursday. I'll be coding by myself again, and we'll be getting ready for Friday's architecture workshop. Thanks so much, Rocky. I really appreciate you joining me here this morning.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jeff.
All righty. And we'll see all of you next time. Take care.